Thank you, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone. It's heartening to see that while we have a separate panel session today on decarbonisation, as we often do, we've seen the topic come through in every previous discussion this morning, and I'm sure for the rest of this conference, the concept of energy transition and sustainability and ESG, if we're still allowed to say that, will probably still continue to filter through into all of the conversations. So this panel gives us a chance to maybe dive a little bit deeper into some of the elephants in the room and some of the topics which we know have been bubbling away for a while but haven't quite addressed. And today we have with us different perspectives. Mathieu from the Liberian flag will provide a bit of guidance on the flag's perspective, but also where that sits in the larger IMO space. James from the Lloyd's Register Maritime Decarbonisation Hub can provide some guidance on the macro challenges that the industry is facing, and of course Mark from Ardmore can give us the owner's perspective on navigating all these difficult problems. And so perhaps I'll start right with those regulations, and the backdrop being that this week and next week the MEPC are meeting at the IMO to discuss the next round of implementing midterm measures. And we're perhaps not expecting major outcomes quite this week, but we are seemingly getting closer. So James, maybe I'll start with you on this one. So from these MEPC discussions, which I'm sure you've been tracking, do you think we're getting closer to some ability to make commercial decisions? Are we closer to having a carbon tax that we can take to the bank?
Thanks, Shane. Hi, everyone. Good morning. No, good afternoon. I think we are. Whilst it's true that at the end of next week we won't have a formally agreed and ratified measure, I think we should anticipate that we'll have enough consensus from the community of people that are there that will have a fairly strong indication. Actually, I have two of my team there this week, one with a flag delegation and one as an observer. It's early in the week, but what they've been telling me in their prep is that we anticipate that we should have enough of a consensus. And the thing that really seems to be of consequence in the decision that the IMO and the people there need to make in the next 2 weeks is the extent to which they seek a bullish approach to a price on carbon. So the options that there are 7 measures that have been submitted. They have been assessed to a very large degree, both on their impact to the fleets, on their impact to developing nations. So I'll try not to summarize all of that. I'll try to simplify a little bit. So there are, in effect, of all the mechanisms that are under review, there are basically 3 options. There's a pure cost option, which is a carbon tax. So every kilogram of carbon equivalent that you put into the atmosphere, you pay for it. So that's just punitive. There is a sort of incentive, which they're calling a fee bait, which is every kilogram of carbon that you didn't put into the atmosphere, you get incentivized with. You get a credit, or you get some form of financial incentive for. And then there's a blend, which is what I'll simply refer to as the fuel standard, which is where the regulator dictates that the carbon intensity of your fuel has to be a certain amount. And if you exceed that amount, you pay a fine. And if you go under that amount, then you get a refund, as it were. What I think is going to happen is that we will emerge with a blend of a carbon tax at a low level and a fuel standard. So the carbon tax in the initial years will effectively fill up a pot of money, and then the fuel standard will allow for overperformers to draw from that pot of money to reimburse the fleet. Now, I'm not certain that that's what's going to happen. We have to watch what happens in the next 2 weeks. But that's where my personal sense is that that's what I think is going to happen. And the reason that that's very, very consequential is because actually the real impact of this decision is, does it help ship owners ordering new ships, or does it help ship owners managing their existing ships? So one mechanism, a highly cost-centric mechanism, does wonderful things for stimulating the growth and investment that is necessary for alternative fuels, all the way up the supply chain, and incentivizes ship owners like the one to my right here for renewing their fleet. But that is incredibly costly. So the LISCR mechanisms incentivize ship owners and the industry to think about prolonging the life of the ships that they have, about considering more what roles drop-in biofuels will play, about what role perhaps bio or other synthetically derived natural gas might play. So yeah, really a very, very consequential week, which will have midterm and long-term impacts on what decarbonisation pathways start to become viable in the months and years to come. And yeah, my sense is that it's going to make the biofuel pathway feel more, it will gain momentum. And you're kind of seeing the industry sense that already by virtue of the fact that some big orders have gone back to LNG quite recently. Yeah, that's hopefully sets the scene a little bit.
It does, thanks, James. There's a lot of options there which we'll unpack, but maybe I'll go to Mathieu. From your perspective, from the Liberian flag, you obviously have a very influential position at the IMO, but also a very close involvement with many, many owners. And I think you told me in advance you have the largest share of the order book currently on order. So from your perspective, in between these two different angles, there's the IMO debate and there's potential discussions on revenue collection and disbursement, but also hearing from the ship owners at the other end, of course, would prefer to have some of that revenue come back to them and things like that. How do you sit in between these two, and how are you guiding the owners and the operators that you talk to and navigating all these different options?
Thank you, Shane. So just for the record, it's 59 million gross tons for the new building order book, and it is the largest by quite a fair margin for any flag. So 2 points maybe. First, I don't think I can add much to what James said in terms of the options that are available, but the Liberian registry generally, what we have been advocating for is for a global level playing field. I read an interview with the head of the WTO that said there are now 78 different carbon tax mechanisms that are active in the world. In shipping, there's been a proliferation driven by the EU. So I join James in saying I'm hopeful that this week we'll be making some progress on that towards setting a global standard. And that in terms of discussions with owners, the elephant in the room maybe is owners will say, why do I need to talk to flag? What is the relevance? And that's something that we're trying to have discussions with owners and to show them what the added value is that we can provide. So on the first panel earlier this morning, Caroline mentioned certainty. And this is something that I think for owners is extremely important. And we're trying to provide certainty on the regulatory side. So that'll take 3 forms that we're doing at the moment. So the first is in terms of leveraging our competence in terms of being the arbiter for goal-based standards for the IMO. So it's the flag state that can review, assess, and approve equivalencies. Equivalencies are alternative ways to meet the existing standards without sacrificing any level of safety. So there's many ways to skin a cat. We're not eating the cats, just skinning them. And in terms of what we can do, we're a flag. We have quite a bit of internal expertise for a flag, and what's most important for us is to be able to work with partners in the industry, such as the shipyards, the classification societies, and the owners, to provide themselves with some regulatory certainty. So if they're working on crazy innovation or for things where there is no regulatory framework, they can be confident that working with us, they'll be able to get the necessary regulatory approvals. This feeds into the second part, which is shaping the regulatory framework. So by being involved with owners at an earlier stage, we're conscious of what's coming down the pipeline, and we can try to shape the regulatory framework at the IMO level so that it reflects what's actually being done in practice. So at CCC 10 last week, we just finalized interim guidelines for the use of ammonia on ships as fuel, and that's something that we're hopeful is going to be passed at the next MSC. And that's a big part of what we're doing. The third thing is in terms of facilitating recognition and acceptance at an international level. So this feeds in, again, if we're involved at the start and we are documenting the reasons, the technical basis, and the conditions under which we're allowing deviations in terms of equivalencies. Then when these new ships with new technologies, new designs are going into different ports, the PSC authorities can check what's been done, and it also sort of creates new international standards as to practice, and these ships are trading internationally, so that's extremely important. And since we're at Marine Money, I mean, there is also a financial aspect to having equivalencies versus exemptions. Equivalencies is a lower risk profile, and we hope that by working with owners in terms of the marketability of those vessels and the future resale value, ships that have been granted equivalencies will do better than what has been done maybe in the past with exemptions.
Thanks, Mathieu. So what I'm hearing there is that we're getting a bit of direction and certainty from the IMO. We're starting to see which direction we're going, and even if we don't have the specifics quite figured out. But it's not just a case of us sitting back and waiting for that final number, it's perhaps informing those conversations as industry and guiding some of that. And I mean, that's very much in line what we at GCMD do, as you mentioned, with things like the fuel standards for ammonia and the rules there. Just recently, last week, we did a pilot project with ammonia, which my colleague will talk about later. But it's about informing those conversations and making sure that the regulations are supporting industry, but also achieving their outcomes. So if we're getting a bit of that direction now, I guess we still have to figure out what specific options we want to use, and there are still many, many options on the table. So Mark, if I bring you in from your perspective, and I know you're operating a slightly older fleet and it's a little bit more diverse, but there's an awful lot of options on the table right now. So why don't we start with the fuels, perhaps? What's in fashion right now?
What's in fashion right now is what's in use right now, to be quite honest. But let me start by saying this. Ship owners have got a very limited concentration span. And let's be honest, this is a long game. And it's a long game that doesn't have a lot of new news. And it's certainly a game that doesn't have a lot of exciting news, especially when everything seems to come with a large dollar value number attached to it. So you could perhaps forgive some ship owners for calling out the white noise that there is around this. And there's a lot of people taking a lot of positions. And why would you take a position on a future fuel right now unless you were fairly certain that it had a cost element attached to it? Either you're going to be clever and you're going to get the cheaper option, or you're going to get the more available option, or you're going to make some call based on some dynamic as you currently understand it for a future opportunity that might be 5 or 10 years down the road. Come back to ship owners having that short concentration span. It's really going to be difficult. When you think about everything that's going on, I'm sorry, James, it's not sexy. It really is not. The IMO is not going to fill me with, got to go there next week and sit there and listen to that. You got to bring it back to us in a way where the language is simple, clearly understood, and that the options, such as they are options, are going to be able to be interpreted for each individual player, because whether you're in a time charter relationship or spot, we have very different interpretations of that. So the future fuels that are out there, I think, guys, let's not get carried away with ourselves. Hydrocarbon fuels are going to be around for a long time. Carbon capture deserves and needs a lot more awareness, understanding, a lot more support in the industry, because it's going to be in the mix no matter what. So that's not said from a position of disappointment or lack of ambition. That's said from a position of absolute reality and understanding, both commercially and practically. As regards other fuels, there's over 500,000 hours. Think about that for a moment. Do the math. There's over 500,000 hours of existing engine experience running on methanol right now. That's a lot of hours, and that's a lot of experience. And I'd encourage people in the room to do themselves a favor and talk to people who've actually operated ships with methanol and understand the path of experience that they've had, because they didn't get it right on day one, and they didn't get it right on the first overhaul of a cylinder either. So the path that methanol's been on has been one of tried and tested, and has done some great stuff in bringing methanol into a real practical current fuel, not just a future fuel. people will know in the room if they've listened to me before, I'm no fan of anything that could indicate a real complication when you're running a 10-year-old chip. I think a lot of people have fallen in love with this idea of running a 1-year-old chip and thinking that post the guarantee claim, you're still going to be running that beautiful chip in the same shiny fashion. That's not the way 10-year-old chips are run. So let's not forget that future fuels are going to have a learning curve. Those learning curves need to involve the safety of the operation of staff on board. And I think sometimes boardrooms might at the moment be overlooking that angle.
Thanks, Mark. So you mentioned a few different options there, and it'd be good to talk about some of those there. So even on methanol, 500,000 running hours is quite significant. It's probably almost the same amount of time we've been talking about. Is methanol going to be the right fuel, or is it going to be ammonia? But maybe, James, if I can bring you in on this one. On methanol particularly, have we reached peak methanol in terms of ordering, or is there more to come?
I would consider that question from a timeline perspective. So I don't think that methanol is going away in the medium term at all, but I fully acknowledge that very recently the appetite to place methanol optionality into your technical specification has abated, with a few big signals from big players who everyone would recognize, surprising the industry. I'm mainly talking about Maersk, aren't I? But I think that has come from a place of wanting to see what gets agreed this week, because, as we mentioned earlier, it does have a very big impact on future earnings potential and cash flows, etc. And B, well, with all of these new fuels, whether it's ammonia, whether it's methanol, it feels to me like we have gone through we are going through an enthusiasm curve. So when they are first discussed, enthusiasm is high, understanding of the decision is low. And to address that, we start working out what does it actually mean to try to use these fuels. So understanding goes up, complexity and difficulty goes up, so enthusiasm comes down. And enthusiasm is down now for methanol and for ammonia because we've got a really good picture now of just how hard it's going to be to make sure that at a supply chain level, end to end, these are going to be viable transition pathways for the industry. But it's in that trough of enthusiasm where you've got to not lose sight of the destination. You have to actually ask yourself the question, only will enthusiasm return? Will momentum continue to build? And will, therefore, the investment continue to arrive? And will we get back out of this trough? So I think we're in the trough at the moment, but I don't think that means that methanol is off the cards, that it's peaked. It just means for what we know now, we see more of how difficult it is to achieve it than how we're going to achieve it, if that makes sense.
It does. So where does that put LNG on that same curve? Are we in the trough? Have we come out?
Well, LNG seems to be a troughing, peaking wave all the time. And what I think is happening with LNG is that primarily through investments in the US, bolstered on by the Inflation Reduction Act, and by investments in the European Union, you have seen at a municipal and land-based level a sudden increase in the production of biogas. So biogas, which is fermented from agricultural waste products or municipal waste products, a lot of those treatment facilities have had investment recently to increase their production of biogas. And that biogas is getting, in their respective jurisdictions, reintroduced into the grid, but does not yet have a mandated consumer of the credit. So the credit is produced by virtue of this investment. It is a biofuel, and there is a carbon credit associated with it. But the land-based industries in these two jurisdictions do not yet require the consumption of that. So the power sectors do not yet mandate their consumption. So suddenly there's a surplus of biogas-derived credits. So the industry is going, that's a signal that my LNG pathway will become a bio-LNG pathway. And so that's why I think that the enthusiasm curve, going back to that in LNG, is back on its rise, because people have seen those two things happening and going, right, okay, that's enough of a strong signal to me that I can feel positive about LNG. I would place a few warnings about that enthusiasm in an unmetered capacity. The first is that, especially in the European Union, the consumptions of those credits is going to come in the European Union's power sector. So when the national policies of the European Union start looking at measuring and mandating the reduction in their carbon intensity of their domestic power, the ones that are produced in Europe might disappear. And the other thing is the extreme complexity of the way in which these credits are actually traded. So the life cycle assessment regulations that are national or at best regional but not international prevent the trading of those credits across jurisdictions. So they are quite self-limiting in the way that they're set up. So yeah, I get where the enthusiasm's coming, but I wouldn't look at that and say, I definitely therefore feel that LNG is no problem. It will be bio-LNG. It will be at a big proportion. No issue here. Let's just invest.
I think you took us through a peak and trough there in that answer. So good job at illustrating that point. But Mark, you also mentioned carbon capture, and actually I'll come to Mathieu first on this one, because the Liberian flag submitted a paper, was it last year now, on a trial with the carbon capture system, and that went through to the IMO and probably triggered one of the regulatory processes to now see if that can be adopted. So does the Liberia flag have a particular position on carbon capture, or a feeling for whether this is going to be one of the solutions that's more and more adopted? And do you have any sense for how that regulatory framework is developing, and is it promising for carbon capture?
Again, I mean, it goes back to our approach, which is that on decarbonization, we're agnostic. When it comes to fuel, we're agnostic. What we do want to see is that if owners are investing in technologies that are delivering results and that are getting closer for us to get to net zero, then those should be recognized and incorporated in the regulatory framework. So the gist of our proposal, which was joint proposal, I believe, with ICS, and I think we have 3 proposals that are being discussed this week that we're co-sponsoring, is to ensure that whether it's calculations for attained CII or EEDI, that those are actually, incorporated, and there is a study. Obviously, you need to have some proof of concept, but we don't think that this is the only solution. It's one amongst many. It's the same thing with fuel. If everyone's going in the same fuel choice, then there won't be enough supply. So I think we want to encourage as many approaches as possible, and we just don't want to be a stick in the wheel for owners. So if they're putting in money, if they're taking in that risk, then we want, from a regulatory standpoint, to be there to support them in their efforts.
I'm going to just push back a little bit on that, because I totally get, we have to support these kind of innovations and stuff, but does it actually help provide any certainty to the industry when we're kind of trying out everything and supporting everything if owners want to? Or are we able to actually focus some of that effort a bit more than I guess it needs to be?
I think that's maybe a question of where you lean on your political spectrum on government intervention and if the government should be telling industry how to run their business. I'm aware of the, carbon capture is not, everyone is not a fan. We want to change some behaviors, and some people say that doing that is just not really, it's a Band-Aid solution. That's not for the Liberian registry to tell owners what they should be doing. I do think that, Stamatis mentioned paint. That's actually in all the technologies. It's simple, but it's working. Okay, so that's what we should be encouraging. We're always talking about, collaboration, innovation. That's what we're going to be there as a flag. Not everyone is going to say that it's the right thing to do, but that's not my job, and that's not our job as a registry.
Fair enough. So Mark, let's come back to your fleet particularly, because it's not the youngest. It's mixed and operating globally. It's a difficult one to decarbonize for sure, and there's a lot you're doing in the space, like paint coatings and energy efficiency. So first of all, with your fleet particularly, looking at the shipyards which are full and asset prices are high for new buildings now, how long do you think you have to operate the ships to, and are they going to be there in this 2030, this checkpoint that the IMO has set where we have tough targets to meet? And if so, how are they going to be contributing? What role are they going to be playing in that time period?
Yeah, just in terms of age profile, in terms of the product tanker fleet, our ships are just under 10 years old, and boy, where did that time go? But they, Stamatis made some really, really good points earlier about the way that we operate our ships, and I think there's a physicality element to what we put on their ships, and there's a human element too, and boy, do I see a difference in the way that some chief engineers, I'm not just saying captains actually, chief engineers run their engine rooms. So there is really a genuine human element to this. And what we've been doing is taking an energy transition champion on board our fleet at the most junior levels. So we are putting out there on a quarterly basis, you want to win an iPad, come up with the best idea on board a ship for saving more fuel. And boy, do you get the young people involved in the ship. And you give them an iPad a quarter, and suddenly they're coming up with, hey, what about, well, we've done the LED lights, but, what about extraction fans? What about slowing down engine room fans for slow steaming? Why have we still got so many fans blowing air into the engine room? The questions are coming from within to make the current fleet even more attractive by doing things that they can contribute to. So, with the challenges that we're going through now, with a 15-year typical lifespan that we're seeing on tankers and oil majors, mainstream use for ships, there is a question: is that going to be extended up to 20? And there's a very good environmental argument to do so, because I think these ships are becoming more and more and more fuel efficient. Ships that were built in that 2013 plus era are already, with the electronic engines, have already got some really attractive gadgets on them. I do think, though, it's worth remembering that you have really two chances in a ship's life to make a change: 5 years old and 10 years old. You're no longer doing those intermediate dockings, so you've got two chances for your ROIC to kick in and actually give you a multiple return on that investment. And ROIC is not a bad denominator for a way to look at a technology. I think if ships are going to move beyond 15, particularly tankers, into the 20-year sphere, you're going to be docking at 17.5. So I think you have to think about the incremental impact that will have. Speed, of course, is a huge factor that we've all got in our trades. And we've been doing some really good stuff with a company called Fuel Opt to take the concept of constant speed in your car to constant power. Constant power equals constant emissions. And what we're able to do is predict much more accurately the emissions we're going to produce on a voyage, taking all the noise of weather and other things out of it, and then look at the port availability. And I think very often the question that's lacking is not what are we doing, it's what's the entire supply chain doing. What are the port arrival times, and what is the port scheduling looking like, so that we understand when we get there, what number are we going to be in the lineup. But running older ships is very much about a balance between asset value and what that asset value is going to look like at 15 for us versus at 20. And the question is, who are you going to sell those 20-year-old assets to? We know who the 15-year-old asset market is. Is that same market going to be present 5 years' time, wanting to buy ships at that point? And that might be a dynamic that shifts that we don't quite yet understand.
That's totally fair. And I guess it's also you're competing with other peers in that group, in that space, to be the most efficient and to be operating in a slightly more competitively advantageous way. And so, of course, the things like the paint coatings and all the innovative things that's becoming more and more adopted. But how far do you go with these kind of retrofits? If it's a 10-year-old ship, maybe 15-year-old docking, as third special coming up, are we still willing to retrofit those? And can we do them with the more expensive kind of retrofits, like the multi-million-dollar air lubrication or wind assistance kind of things, where it becomes a bit of a cash constraint as well?
I think ROIC is your simple measure. As a public company, our numbers are put out in the market. Our profitability is pretty clear. So I think, yes, there is still value for putting in high-value retrofits at these 10-year-old marks, particularly in tankers. We've certainly lived through that. Do remember, though, that you don't get all technology right the first time around. So we have this inherent fear of failure. And I think a lot of it goes with the ego that is present in the room. I could tell you more about my failures sometimes. They're more interesting than my successes. But we don't do that, do we? And maybe we should learn a little more from each other.
You're on the stage now. Go for it.
We might need a bit longer for that one. So we hear there's plenty of options, and there's lots of things that we can do, and many of them will be expensive, and some may be viable, some maybe not. But we also need to address these bigger problems coming down the road, the alternative fuels and so on at the same time, and somewhere we have to find ways of paying for that. And in the container segment, perhaps it is a little bit more clear that there's a little bit of demand for the biofuels and the methanol dropping in. But it's less obvious in other sectors, I think, where we're a bit further detached from the end consumer. So I'll talk a little bit or ask a bit about what kind of efforts are in place now to connect up that supply chain for shipping and find the right way to share those risks and costs through. So perhaps, James, if I start with you here from this angle, from like the fuel supply infrastructure that we need to build up, how are you approaching that?
Sure, thank you. So when we got started at the Hub in trying to support Maritime's decarbonisation, we focused on the demand side for alternative fuels initially. So like many others, we created a green corridor structure called the Silk Alliance. Actually, Shane was quite involved in that when he was with us in the past. And we focused on demand aggregation. And we hoped that aggregating demand would be a strong enough signal to producers and to the supply side to unlock the necessary investment. And no surprise, it didn't actually do that. It helped, but the crux of the issue is there a ship owner prepared to sign an offtake agreement? That's what producers, their current mindset is in at the moment. And that's a whole different problem we should probably talk about in a minute. So then we thought, okay, if we're making progress on understanding demand side, but it's not making material change, we need to try to do something to unlock the supply side. So what we realized was that fuel producers currently were sort of interacting with us on pure commercial terms. So as, show me a business case that's bankable and we'll do it, no problem. I often hear people saying there's no finance available. It's like, no, that's not the problem. The money's there. It's just you're not giving a compelling case to unlock the money. So then we thought, okay, well, how do we bridge that gap? And so we started talking to the international development sector and the international, I call them the change actors. It's all the UN agencies, the NGOs, all these people who have access to a lot of resource, but their mandate is to commence change, and they all flow through from what's agreed at COP on an annual basis. So we started thinking, well, we as an industry, we talk a lot to ministries of transport because they are our partner regulator, so we're used to interacting with them, but they look at our sector from a quality perspective. How do I make sure that you stay compliant, there are no accidents, et cetera, et cetera. They don't at all look at our sector from a resource perspective. Does the sector need the resources, and what does my role as a national economy play or contribute to what Maritime can unlock? So we started talking to energy ministries, and what we've got now is a platform where we interact with nations who have high hydrogen fuel production possibility or potential based on either their resources or their geology or whatever, but who don't have an incumbent oil and gas economy, and so don't understand the energy sector, and say, look, why don't you have a look at Maritime and have a look at what the future contribution to your national economy might be of a hydrogen-derived energy sector, and let's try to get you excited about making national policies that unlock national investment in underwriting those initial cost gaps in the investment in the production of fuels that are preventing conventional finance from entering and just funding these programs. And that's kind of, it's for us, that feels like the place where you've got to focus your effort at the moment, because that's what's missing. Banks know how to assess what's on their plate, what's been offered up to them as investable or not, whether it's a shipping bank or whether it's someone supporting the energy sector. and they just don't like what they see, and that's why those things aren't going forward. So we have to find a way to get them to like it. And there is so much money in the development sector, in the international development banks, and the big philanthropics who want to put money in it. They just don't know how. So we're trying to bring them together.
And Mathieu, if I come to you on a similar point then, so I think it's a very fair point that ship owners probably typically engage with government bodies via like the flag state and have that typical relationship with the Ministry of Transport and so on. But it needs to connect a bit wider when we're talking about these bigger challenges and fuel supply and other kind of innovations that are coming down the line. And so how do you, as the flag state, probably their first port of call, try to engage deeper into that conversation and bring in perhaps other supporting ministries or things like that, or at the IMO level, to try and support these kind of developments?
Well, quite honestly speaking, Liberia is not the first port call for most of our owners. In terms of what we can do as a flag state, it can be something even more basic. Mark made allusions to crewing and the competence that we need to have on board, and even the qualifications. So we've had some new building deliveries where we've been able to gain ships because of our ability to, one, have training centers that are recognized for some of these so for the IGF COPs that they need to have. So we have training in centers in China that have been recognized for Liberia and that they can get the certificates for. We've been able to take a pragmatic approach, for example, to credit sea time. Instead of sea time, they can do trials while the vessel is still in the yard, and it goes on the sea trials as well. So that type of flexibility to facilitate is what we can do as a flag state. In terms of the oil ministries and all that, not the right guy again. We're really on the flag state side, but generally speaking, I think we always talk about collaboration, and Liberia as a flag, that's what we're all about, and that's what we're doing.
Absolutely, and we're holding everyone up for lunch, so I'll quickly come to a quick conclusion, and I'll ask for everyone for just 10, 20 seconds on, we've talked about these challenges that are coming down the road, and we have big targets for 2030, and some of these things are viable, but a lot are not yet commercially viable on the fuel infrastructure and so on. So what do we need to be here this time next year, in 12 months' time, to happen in the next 12 months so that we can make significant and major investments into decarbonization, but also commercially viable, competitive solutions for the industry to move forward? Mark, I'll come to you first.
20 seconds. 14 of the world's biggest banks have pledged support for nuclear energy in an effort to meet with COP28 climate negotiations last year to triple the world's nuclear capacity by 2050. I think if you leave nuclear out of the equation, ashore, never mind at sea, we're not going to do it. So open your eyes to nuclear.
A nice controversial conclusion. With support, I like that. James?
I'll go far more simple than that. Just stay enthusiastic. It might seem difficult, but we can get there.
Mathieu?
I'll go even simpler. Marine money.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much to the panelists for the conversation, and thank you very much to the audience.